A struggling farmer teetering on the brink of losing everything lends a hand to a young woman in trouble. Little does he know, this simple act of kindness will turn his world upside down. Before we dive in, don't forget to like and follow for more powerful stories that will stay with you. Now let's begin. If I sell Estrella, how much longer can I hang on? Ray muttered under his breath, his hand brushing over the mare's smooth back. The horse flicked her ears, almost like she understood the weight of his thoughts. Ray let out a long sigh, feeling the crushing burden of the dry years pressing on his shoulders like sacks of stone. The sun was relentless that afternoon, splitting the dirt beneath his boots and serving as a harsh reminder of what he already knew. The land his family had poured their blood and sweat into was slowly dying. 3 years without rain had wiped out his crops, drained his savings, and worse, robbed him of hope. Every week, the bank sent another letter. Every month, the interest ballooned, like weeds swallowing up what little was left. Selling Estrella was the only real card he had left to play, but letting her go felt like giving up. And Ray wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. He clicked his tongue, his eyes scanning the horizon for something, anything, to pull his thoughts elsewhere. That's when he spotted it. A rising cloud of dust tearing down the dirt road in the distance. A motorcycle, kicking up gravel and dry earth as it sped along. Something felt off. In a blink, the bike lost control, skidding sideways and crashing off the path. Ray didn't hesitate. He nudged Estrella into a gallop, racing across the open field toward the wreck. When he arrived, the motorcycle lay on its side, and the rider, clearly a woman, was slowly pushing herself up. She didn't seem seriously hurt, but the way she clutched her helmet suggested the fall had shaken her. "You okay?" Ray asked, dismounting and walking toward her carefully. The woman lifted her head, her dark eyes flashing with a mix of irritation and defiance. "I'm fine. The bike's not," she snapped, yanking off her helmet in one sharp motion. Her black hair tumbled out, tousled by the wind. Her skin was fair, her features strong, and despite the dirt and heat, she looked like none of it fazed her in the slightest. Ray swung himself over the fence and crouched down beside the motorcycle, inspecting it with the eyes of someone who'd fixed 1,000 machines before. "Fuel injection's shot," he muttered, touching part of the engine. "You're not fixing that here," the woman said flatly, pulling her phone from her jacket like someone who's always got a backup plan. But her face tightened when she glanced at the screen. She frowned, waving the phone in the air like it might magically catch a signal. "No service." Ray let out a low chuckle and shook his head. "Welcome to the countryside, ma'am. Cell service out here is like a ghost. Some folks swear they've seen it, but no one can prove it." She huffed in frustration and shoved the phone back into her pocket. Her eyes scanned the empty road and the dried-out fields before falling to her boots, clearly built for riding, not for an 8-mile trek under the blazing sun. "The nearest town?" she asked with a sigh. "Serra Dorada's about 5 miles south, but don't count on anyone driving by this way today," Ray replied. She pressed her lips together, clearly weighing her options. Ray folded his arms, waiting. "My name's Ray Nunez. This is my ranch," he said calmly. "You're welcome to come back to the house. I've got a landline. You can call someone to pick you up." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing with a flicker of caution. It wasn't surprising. A lone woman in the middle of nowhere had every reason to be wary of a stranger offering help. But finally, she reached out her hand. "Rachel." Ray took it, noticing her palms, calloused, not soft. These were hands that had known work. "Nice to meet you, Rachel. Now you've got 2 choices. Wait for a car that might never show up, or take me up on my offer." Rachel studied Ray with a guarded look. She wasn't naive. Life had taught her long ago that acts of pure kindness were rare, especially coming from strangers. Still, something in his voice, the calm, steady tone of someone who had nothing to hide, nudged her into making a swift decision. "All right," she said. "I'll take the offer." Ray didn't say a word, just gave a small nod and climbed back onto Estrella with the ease of a man born in the saddle. Then, he extended his hand to her. 2 options again.
Walk 5 miles in this heat, or trust my horse." Rachel raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement dancing in her eyes like the idea of a challenge had just sparked her interest. "It's been years since I've ridden a horse." "Then maybe it's time you remember how," he replied. Without another second of hesitation, she grabbed his hand and swung herself up behind him in one smooth motion. At first, there was a bit of space between them, a quiet formality. But as Estrella settled into her stride, the gentle rhythm of her gait nudged Rachel closer until her hand brushed softly against Ray's back. The path to the ranch was bathed in the golden tones of late afternoon light. The sun dipped slowly toward the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that settles between two people who haven't figured out what to say yet, and maybe don't need to. When they reached the house, Ray pulled Estrella to a stop and swung down in one fluid move. Then he reached up to help Rachel dismount. "Welcome to my humble place," he said, his tone carrying more weariness than pride. Rachel looked around. The house wasn't large, nor did it try to be impressive, but it had the warmth of somewhere that had been lived in for generations. The wood along the siding was weathered, the porch creaked beneath her boots, and an old rocking chair swayed slightly in the breeze. They stepped inside. On the dining table, a pile of papers caught Rachel's eye. Some opened. Others crumpled from being handled too many times. Bills, letters, bank notices. She didn't say a word, but Ray noticed how her eyes lingered a moment too long. "Want some water?" he asked, gently shifting the conversation. "Yes, please." While Ray headed to the kitchen, Rachel let her gaze roam across the room. It was a modest home, but everything about it whispered of stories. Framed photographs lined the wall, black and white snapshots of men and women posing beside tractors and horses. Working folks. People like Ray. When he returned with the glass of cold water, she took it quietly and sipped. "I can make you something to eat," he offered, leaning a hand on the table. "That's not necessary. I don't want to trouble you more than I already have." Ray shook his head. "It's no trouble, and if you're gonna be here a little while, might as well have something in your stomach." Rachel studied him for a moment. He wasn't the kind of man who said things just to be polite. He offered because he meant it. "If you insist," she said finally with the smallest smile. Ray nodded and turned back toward the kitchen. As he put together a simple meal, he could sense Rachel moving through the space behind him. She wasn't nosy, but he knew she was watching, piecing together who he was without needing to ask. When dinner was ready, they set the plates on the table. The first few minutes passed in silence until Rachel finally spoke. "Have you always lived here?" Ray looked up. "Since the day I was born." "Never thought about leaving?" "Now and then," he admitted, "but leaving would feel like giving up. And I'm not quite ready for that yet." Rachel held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, like she understood exactly what he meant. When they finished eating, Ray stood up and carried the dishes to the sink. Then, he leaned back against the wall and folded his arms. "I've got a guest room out back," Ray said, his voice calm. "It's not the Ritz, but the bed's decent enough." Rachel locked eyes with him, weighing his offer carefully. "How much do you want for the night?" Ray blinked, caught off guard. "You don't owe me anything. Just one night, that's all." Rachel raised an eyebrow, her tone sharpening. "I'm not a fan of charity." Ray let out a quiet sigh and rubbed the back of his neck, casting a sideways glance at the pile of bank notices still lying on the table. "All right then, just cover whatever you use." Rachel smirked, lifting her glass of water in a small rye toast. "Deal." And just like that, the conversation was over. Ray led her to the guest room, then stepped out onto the porch. He stood there for a long while, watching the evening wrap itself around the ranch like a blanket. Ray wasn't one to sleep in. Years of tending land had trained him to rise before the first light. But that morning, when he opened the door and stepped outside, he wasn't the first one up. Rachel was already there, sitting in the old wooden rocker with a coffee mug wrapped in both hands.
her gaze fixed far out on the horizon. Ray couldn't quite read the look on her face. It wasn't just someone enjoying a sunrise. There was more to it, something deeper simmering beneath the surface. "You're up early," he said, breaking the quiet spell of the morning. Rachel turned slightly, her mind clearly still lingering elsewhere. "Habit," she murmured, taking a small sip of her coffee. "I've always liked getting a head start on the world." Ray leaned against the doorframe, watching her. Since the moment she'd arrived, there'd been a wall around her, a silent shield that kept most things in and everyone else out. But in moments like these, when she thought no one was looking, that wall seemed to soften. "And what do you usually do with all that early time?" he asked. "Think." Ray didn't press her on what she thought about. Everyone has their own ghosts to wrestle with. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. In fact, it was one of the few silences Ray actually welcomed. Not like the silence of overdue bills stacked on a table, or of bank collectors who left envelopes without a word. This silence felt shared, peaceful. Eventually, Rachel turned away from the horizon and looked at him. "Have you ever thought about leaving this place?" Ray gave a faint smile, one of those that flicker and vanish in a heartbeat. "Leaving would mean giving up, and I'm not the kind to give up." Rachel seemed to weigh that answer for a moment. Then she gave a small nod and returned her eyes to the open land ahead. Ray straightened and headed toward the barn. There was work waiting for him. He didn't expect her to follow, but when he turned around, there she was, only a few steps behind, dressed far more practically than she had been the night before. "What are you doing? Need a hand?" Rachel asked, her tone completely casual. Ray wasn't quite sure what to make of it. The image of her, in clothes clearly once meant for an office, offering to help out on a ranch, didn't fit neatly into any box. But he didn't say no. Instead, he decided to test her. "Let's see how quick you catch on." Rachel didn't answer, but the slight tilt of her head made it clear she was in. The morning unfolded slowly. The heat began to creep in, but Ray barely noticed. He was used to it. What did catch his attention was Rachel's grit. She didn't lag behind, didn't complain. She observed closely, picked up fast, and when he gave her a task, she carried it out without flinching. When they reached the irrigation system, Ray pointed to one of the main pipes. "We need to check for leaks. If it's busted, we'll need to replace it." Rachel knelt beside him, ran her hand along the dusty pipe, and nodded. "Tell me what to do." Ray couldn't help the small grin that tugged at the corner of his mouth. He'd assumed she'd give up after 10 minutes under the sun. But there she was, face smudged with dirt, hands steady, and a fierce resolve in her eyes. They worked in silence for a good while. Every so often, Ray glanced over, quietly surprised to find her still right there. Once the pipe was fixed, they both stood and brushed the dust from their clothes. "Not bad," Ray said, giving her a light nudge on the shoulder. "Don't go underestimating people, Ray," Rachel replied with a faint smile playing on her lips. They stood quietly for a moment, letting the breeze wash over them, offering brief relief from the heat. Back at the house, Ray didn't ask where she was going. He simply watched as she veered toward the barn where Estrella was resting. The mare raised her head as soon as Rachel stepped inside and let out a soft breath. Rachel approached slowly, almost respectfully, as if mindful not to startle her. "So, you're the legendary Estrella, huh?" she whispered, stretching out a cautious hand. Estrella sniffed her fingers, blinked slowly, then leaned in, accepting the touch. Ray leaned against the barn door frame, arms crossed. "Looks like she likes you." Rachel didn't turn around. She just kept stroking the horse's mane. "I've always had a thing for horses," she said softly. "But it's been a long time since I've been this close to one." There was something in her voice, something more than nostalgia, something heavier. Ray heard it, but didn't push. "Estrella's one of a kind," he said after a beat. "She's been with me through everything. When everything else started falling apart, she was the one thing I couldn't bring myself to sell." Rachel slid her fingers along Estrella's back, not saying a word,
but the understanding in her silence said plenty. I get it.
Ray looked at her, and for the first time it didn't feel like she was just passing through. There was something in the way she spoke, the way her hand rested gently on Estrella, that told him this woman was carrying a story she wasn't ready to tell. And strangely, he felt no urgency to hear it. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, Ray found Rachel out on the porch, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands, eyes lost somewhere in the horizon. He joined her without a word and sat beside her. It was Rachel who spoke first. Your family must have worked hard to keep this place going. Ray nodded. 5 generations. My granddad built it from the ground up. My father expanded it. And now it's me, just trying to hold it all together. Rachel's gaze drifted across the house, the fields, the worn photographs hanging on the wall. That can't be easy. Ray let out a dry laugh. Easy doesn't even come close. Rachel didn't reply. She didn't offer him empty encouragement or try to fix a problem she didn't understand. She simply nodded and took another sip of her coffee. The day eased into motion slowly. The sound of roosters breaking the stillness of dawn, wooden floorboards creaking beneath Ray's boots as he made his usual rounds. It was a routine he knew well. Check the fields, feed the animals, keep things running even when the money had run dry. But this morning he wasn't alone. Passing by the guest room window, he caught a glimpse of Rachel packing a few things into her backpack. She didn't look like she was leaving just yet, but she didn't seem like someone planning to stay for long either. We're heading into town, Ray announced as she stepped onto the porch. Rachel looked up from her coffee. Why? To check on your bike. Old man Paulo's probably got something to say about the repairs by now. Rachel gave a small nod, like she'd been expecting that moment. Ray studied her for a second, before turning toward the truck. They didn't talk much on the ride down the dusty road into the small town. The morning sun had just begun to warm the ground, and the dry land stretched endlessly in every direction. Neither of them was in a hurry. The silence inside the cab was thick but not uncomfortable, weighted with things neither had found the words for yet. It was Ray who finally broke it. Who are you? Really, Rachel? She didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed locked on the horizon, her fingers fidgeting with the zipper on her jacket. I'm a businesswoman. The reply came quick and clean, like something rehearsed, too polished to be spontaneous. Ray didn't answer right away. He kept one hand steady on the wheel as they eased into a curve. Uh-huh. Rachel turned toward him, one eyebrow lifted. Uh-huh? I said uh-huh because that didn't really answer my question. She pressed her lips together, clearly weighing how much to reveal. I run a few businesses. That's it. Ray let out a soft snort but didn't press. He'd learned that some truths only surface when they're good and ready. Paulo's repair shop was right where it had always been, worn down and crooked, like it had been through more decades than anyone could count. Paulo himself, with his thick mustache and grease-stained t-shirt, greeted them with the kind of calm that said he'd been expecting them all along. Ah, there you are! The bike's gonna take a bit longer than I thought, Paulo said flatly, skipping any kind of greeting. Rachel crossed her arms. How much longer? Paulo wiped his hands on an old rag and gave her a knowing smirk. Another day, maybe 2. Ray didn't miss the way the old mechanic looked at her, not at the motorcycle but at Rachel, as if he was sizing up something far beyond a busted engine. You don't seem in too big a rush to leave, Paulo added, his tone the kind that only comes from people who've seen too much and learned to speak in riddles. Rachel gave a faint smile, saying nothing. Ray glanced at her from the corner of his eye while she chatted with the mechanic. Something about the way she stood, the way she listened. He just knew. Rachel wasn't the kind of woman to stop in the middle of nowhere without a reason. Back in the truck, the silence returned as the town slowly faded behind them and the wide, open stretch of ranch land took over the view. Ray drove with the same slow steadiness as always, but his mind kept circling the same question. Eventually, it was Rachel who spoke. I'm a billionaire. Ray didn't react right away. His eyes stayed on the road, hands steady on the wheel. I know. Rachel blinked. You know? Ray offered a slight smile. Didn't know for sure, but I figured. How? She asked, genuinely curious. He shrugged. You talk business like someone who sat on the other side of the table. Your clothes, dust or not, aren't off the rack. And no one raised in the countryside rides a horse with that kind of ease unless they've done it before. Rachel fell silent, processing his words. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen without the filter of her wealth. There was no awe in Ray's tone, no hungry curiosity, just a quiet observation, spoken as plainly as one might comment on the sky. But then he asked something that made her breath catch. If your life's as perfect as the magazines say, then why are you here? Rachel looked down, a weight pressing into her chest that she hadn't wanted to name. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned to the window, watching the barren landscape drift past. Like maybe, just maybe, the answer was out there. But it wasn't. Or at least not one she could sum up in a single sentence. I don't know, she murmured finally. Ray didn't push. He simply nodded and kept his eyes on the road. In his world, folks spoke when they were ready, not a moment before. The rest of the drive passed in silence. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She'd spent too long running from expectations, dodging camera flashes, sitting in boardrooms so cold and sterile they could drain the life out of anyone. Always deciding, always managing, always surrounded by people who told her what they needed from her, but never once asked what she needed. But here, nobody treated her like a headline. Ray looked at her like he looked at anyone, without demands, without assumptions. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone, powered off and untouched on the nightstand. She knew that if she turned it on, there'd be dozens of messages, missed calls, emails marked urgent. The outside world was still chasing Rachel Villard, the executive, the empire builder. But here, she was just Rachel, and for the first time, that was enough. The first light of dawn was brushing the windows when Rachel stepped into the house and paused at the dining table. The same pile of paperwork was still there. Bills, overdue notices, bank statements filled with numbers that told a story of a farm drowning in debt. Ray never spoke of it out loud, but it was clear in his eyes. The strain, the burden, the quiet fight to hold it all together. She took a deep breath and made a decision. Without overthinking it, she pulled out her phone, turned it on, and dialed a number from memory. I need you to take care of something for me. I want to buy out a debt on a piece of land. Yes, right now. She didn't wait for questions. She didn't offer explanations. Rachel Velarde had closed multi-million-dollar deals in less time than it would take Ray to realize what she had just done. And for once, it had nothing to do with business. Ray returned around midday, his shirt soaked with sweat and his face dusted with dirt. He'd spent the morning working the fields, trying to drown out the stress clawing at the back of his mind. But the moment he walked into the house, he stopped short at the sight of Rachel sitting at the table. In front of her, a sealed envelope rested on the wood. "What's this?" he asked, not moving. Rachel crossed her legs and placed her hands on the table, her expression calm, already prepared for the difficult conversation that was about to follow. "Open it." Ray furrowed his brow but picked it up cautiously, tearing it open and pulling out the documents. And the moment his eyes scanned the first lines, it hit him like a punch to the gut. It was a contract. Clear, concise, and impossible to misread. It stated, in legally binding terms, that the ranch's debt had been wiped clean, that the bank no longer held a claim over his land, that someone had bought it out. "What did you do?" Ray asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Rachel met his stare without flinching. "I paid off your debt." A slow heat crept up Ray's chest, not relief, not exactly. Something more tangled. Something that rubbed against the pride he'd spent a lifetime guarding. Something that whispered of all the years he'd carried the weight of this place alone. "You didn't have to do this. I know. You can't just come here and—" "I didn't do it out of pity, Ray. Her voice was unwavering, slicing through his protest like a clean break. A heavy silence settled in the room. Ray gripped the papers tightly, his breath coming shallow. "Then why?" he finally asked. Rachel didn't look away. "Because I believe in people who refuse to give up. And if you're not giving up on this land, then neither am I." For the first time in what felt like years, Ray didn't know what to say. And maybe it was because part of him already knew. He couldn't reject what she'd just done. Ray was up before sunrise. Same as always. He stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, expecting to find Rachel in the old rocking chair, wearing that far-off look she always wore when the morning light hit the hills. But the chair was empty. Something clenched in his chest, sharp and sudden. He didn't want to admit it, but he'd grown used to seeing her there, to the way her dark eyes lingered on the horizon like she was searching for something she still hadn't found. He stood there a while longer, pretending the coffee was all he needed, when he heard footsteps behind him. "Morning." Rachel's voice was calm, but there was something in her tone, something soft and final, that told Ray what was coming. He didn't answer right away, just nodded toward the empty chair. "Thought I'd find you there." Rachel offered a faint smile. "I was up early. Had some thinking to do." Ray looked down at his mug. He didn't ask what she'd been thinking about. He already knew. "It's time for me to go," she said after a quiet pause. The words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Ray didn't move. He took one last sip of coffee, his gaze still fixed on the land stretching endlessly before them. Then he gave a small nod. "I figured." Rachel folded her arms across her chest like she was holding back something else she wanted to say. Ray didn't look at her when he added, "You've got another world waiting for you." Rachel studied him, searching his face for something he wasn't offering. "Yeah," she said, but her voice didn't sound quite convinced. The silence between them stretched thin, and then she took a slow breath and met his eyes, something strange flickering in hers. "If I come back someday, will you take me in?" Ray held her gaze. There were 1,000 ways he could have answered, but in the end, all he said was, "Might charge you more next time." Rachel smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. The motorcycle was ready. Paolo had done good work. The engine rumbled confidently when she turned the key. Ray stood a few feet away, hands tucked into his pockets, watching. She pulled on her helmet, but before snapping the visor down, she gave him one last look. "Goodbye, Ray." Ray nodded slowly. "Goodbye, Rachel." He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't question her choice to go. And she didn't ask him to stop her. The engine roared as she twisted the throttle and took off down the dusty road. Ray watched her go until the cloud of dirt kicked up by her tires finally began to settle, leaving nothing behind but the quiet sprawl of open land. The ranch was safe now, but his heart, he wasn't so sure. The days that followed passed just the same. Ray was still waking before dawn, brewing his coffee and heading straight out into the fields. He'd check the irrigation system, mend the fences, feed the livestock. The work on the ranch never slowed, and in some quiet, stubborn way, that endless labor served as a shield. But the silence, it wasn't the same anymore. Each morning, his eyes would drift, almost involuntarily, to the old rocking chair on the porch. The wood still creaked with the breeze, but the chair was empty now. No one sat there anymore with a coffee cup resting in their hands, staring into the horizon like they were trying to solve some puzzle only the sky could answer. Sometimes, when he walked past the barn, even Estrella grew restless, snorting, shifting her weight, glancing toward the entrance like she expected to see Rachel walk through at any moment. Like the horse, too, could feel the space she'd left behind. Ray didn't talk about it. Not with his mother, who kept sending letters from town filled with quiet concern. Not with Paolo, who looked at him with that half-smirk, half-warning expression every time Ray drove into town for supplies. Because to talk about it would mean admitting something Ray wasn't ready to face. Rachel hadn't been the same either since she'd left the ranch. She went back to the city, to her glass-walled office and the jam-packed schedule that had always defined her days. Everything picked up exactly where it had left off. The meetings, the deals, the cold, calculated precision of a woman who always knew how to win. But somewhere along the line, something in her began to shift. She caught herself zoning out during high-stakes presentations, her mind drifting to sun-scorched fields, to the feel of leather reins and calloused hands steadying a horse named Estrella. At night, she'd switch on her phone just to scroll down her contacts, stopping on a number she'd never asked for, but that Paolo had scribbled onto a piece of paper before she left. She never called, never texted. But the thought of it, of hearing his voice again, lingered, just under the surface. Time passed, as it always does. The land didn't wait for anyone, and Ray went on with his routine. But one late afternoon, as he worked on repairing a fence near the main road, a sound broke through the wind, a low, rumbling engine. He paused. The familiar echo of a motorcycle bounced off the dry ground before she crested the hill. For a second, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But it wasn't. It was Rachel. She rode slower this time, like she was savoring each foot of dirt road that brought her back. When she reached the entrance of the ranch, she cut the engine and calmly removed her helmet. Her eyes met his, and they held no hesitation, only quiet certainty. "I'm not just passing through this time." Ray didn't move at first. He stood still, watching her, feeling the weight of every word they hadn't spoken. Then, at last, he walked toward her. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations, just a truth exchanged in the hush between two people who no longer needed to fill the air with explanations. And when he took her hand into his, they both understood. This time, Rachel wasn't going anywhere. The story of Ray and Rachel is a deeply human tale of love, endurance, and the search for something real in a world that often trades authenticity for comfort. From the beginning, Ray is shown as a man bound to his land, shouldering hardship with quiet dignity. In contrast, Rachel, despite her fortune, lives caught in a world of image and strategy, where every move is calculated. But the most powerful part of their journey is not what changes around them. It's what transforms within. Ray learns that accepting help isn't the same as surrender. And Rachel realizes that the true worth of life isn't measured in profits, but in honest connections, in things that can't be bought. At its core, this story reminds us that happiness doesn't come from material safety. It lives in our relationships and in the purpose we choose. Ray's ranch becomes more than land. It becomes a symbol of grit, of belonging, and ultimately, of love. Rachel doesn't return because she has to. She comes back because, somewhere along the way, she found what so many spend their lives searching for. A home, not a place, but a person. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and share it. Leave us a comment to tell us how it inspired you. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button.